This is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It is one of the most important horror films ever produced, and it was made independently under difficult and challenging circumstances. There was hardly a budget, the summer heat was miserable, the set stank, and injuries occurred. Texas Chainsaw came into the world with little hope of being seen outside of a few drive-in theaters. Yet under director Tobe Hooper's guidance, this nasty little film changed the horror landscape. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was part of a new wave of horror cinema, gritty, relentless horror pictures that didn't pull any punches. These films were primarily independent productions like George Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. They were also incredibly successful and ultimately totally influential. The films captured nightmarish portraits of contemporary America, with no happy end, even in survival. Texas Chainsaw and its compatriots were cinematic portraits of the scars inflicted by the current state of society. These scars were personified by murderous ghouls menacing the heroes in atmospheric, almost dreamlike plots. Bigger films would soon follow in their wake. For instance, director Ridley Scott claims to have been heavily influenced by the mood of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre when he made Alien, adopting the relentless sense of terror, transplanting it from Texas to outer space. In fact, when pitching the film, Ridley Scott reportedly said that Alien was Texas Chainsaw in space. 20th Century Fox was hooked. Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw is a work of art that emerged from the grittiest of production circumstances. Speaking of grit, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is today mostly remembered for its complete lack of holding back. Yet, Hooper himself felt audiences missed one important aspect of the film: its humor. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually funny. This sense of humor is pitch black. The film's dark humor is also a reflection of people, society, and customs, one that emphasizes alienation over humanity in its narrative. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to call the Texas Chainsaw Massacre a comedy, but there's no denying that Tobe Hooper was having some fun here. Not variety fun, not gag fun, not broad fun. But Hooper was having fun nonetheless. Grotesque fun, allowing a wry take on humanity through the bleakest of horrors.
Come on, Franklin. It's gonna be a fun trip.
About a decade later, when the independent production company The Cannon Group asked for a sequel, Tobe Hooper delivered the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. The film is a black comedy, with Hooper choosing to focus far more on humor than he did in the first film. Cannon bosses Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus were not happy. But then again, Cannon was known in Hollywood as a peddler of schlock, and only a few of their films are legitimately great. Runaway Train comes to mind. So any attempt at something new and different wouldn't be welcomed when there was money to be made by going with the old and familiar. Too bad that in the eyes of the Cannon Group, the old and familiar was usually high camp. To be fair, Golan and Globus weren't asking Hooper to create schlock. They wanted him to repeat his filmmaking feat from the early 1970s. But that was an impossible request.
Listen, this is not gonna work out.
The first Texas Chainsaw had a pitch-perfect blend of darkness and dry, bleak societal observation. It was also a product of a very specific era, in which the American film scene reeled after a disastrous war in Vietnam. The 80s, however, had somehow morphed into the yuppie era. Tobe Hooper was right to change up the formula for the sequel, making it more relevant to the 80s, even if that meant less critical acclaim. Sadly, one thing often mentioned when analyzing Tobe Hooper's career was that he never lived up to his original breakout hit. Texas Chainsaw 2 is funny, but not very scary. And that's okay. I don't think there's any reason to get more of the same. The Texas Chainsaw remake and its sequels demonstrated that lightning doesn't strike twice. These later entries into the franchise were styled after the horror aspects of the original, but they lacked the Tobe Hooper touch. They feel sleeker, more conventional, and less defiant. But what exactly is the Hooper touch? His films are generally thought to be quite uneven, but I think they are important as a body of work, because they offer a singular directorial point of view. Hooper often just went for it, without holding back. And yes, the results generally failed to live up to his Texas Chainsaw breakthrough, but however flawed his later films were, I'm glad we have them, because I'd rather have his unique touch applied to a series of different films and TV shows, rather than just having him repeat himself in Texas Chainsaw territory. Two of the most Hooperish films he made were produced by the Cannon Group, and whatever you can say about Golan and Globus, they deserve kudos for letting Hooper off his leash on Lifeforce and Invaders from Mars. However, the results were commercial and critical failures, but these two films capture something profoundly strange and oddball, and they're obviously made by a filmmaker just having a great time. Lifeforce came out in 1985, and Invaders from Mars followed shortly after in 1986. Personally, I happen to really like Lifeforce, and quite dislike Invaders from Mars, but they are both very clearly Tobe Hooper films. Let's start with Lifeforce, which was a big-budget adaptation of the Colin Wilson novel, The Space Vampires. Halley's comet passes by Earth, just in time for a team of astronauts on board the spaceship Churchill to swing by and find 3 perfectly preserved humanoid bodies inside it. Of course, they mess with said bodies, and soon enough, the terror is brought back to Earth. The bodies, as the title of the novel would have told you, belong to some rather thirsty space vampires. What follows is a hunt for a beautiful escaped monster, where the single surviving astronaut from the Churchill, American Colonel Tom Carlson, help Brits with stiff upper lips track down a walking reign of terror. The space vampire sucks the life force from her victims, turning them into zombified monsters, who now need to suck life force as well, or else this happens. The film is truly oddball, with several highly memorable scenes. Lifeforce also features future Star Trek Captain Patrick Stewart's first on-screen kiss. And it ends with a cataclysm overtaking London, set to bombastic music and high melodrama. Lifeforce is ultimately a bizarre cult film. Nobody but Tobe Hooper could have made it, and the amount of fun he had doing so bleeds through the screen. It is a delightful, if strange, film to watch. Hooper followed his sci-fi horror extravaganza with a remake of the seminal 1953 alien invasion film, Invaders from Mars. The original film was the story of a kid who suspects Martians are invading his quaint hometown. The remake keeps the childlike perspective, updating it with an 80s touch. Hooper stays mostly true to the original, adopting most of its plot and the cheesy tone as well. Hooper's Invaders from Mars is chock full of horror references and callbacks to the original, but it also falters under a goofy script and oddball design choices that seem out of place in the more modern 1980s.
It's the girl! It's the girl!
Oddball. I keep using that word a lot, but it captures Hooper's point of view. It was already there in Texas Chainsaw, back when it worked best, possibly because the film was relentless, raw, and independent.
Look what your brother did to that star!
However, Hooper also made studio films and television. Both of these institutions are known for more rigorous control of their directors and less interest in oddball flourishes.
Before, after, after.
In this more guided production landscape, Tobe Hooper's story isn't always that of a successful artist imposing his point of view on the horror community. I am, of course, talking about Poltergeist, which is an excellent horror film, but also one with a complicated behind-the-scenes history. Poltergeist was conceived by Steven Spielberg, who also co-wrote the script and produced. Due to the ongoing active development of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Spielberg couldn't take the directing reins himself. The job instead went to Tobe Hooper. However, Spielberg was deeply involved on set, and rumors soon came out that Hooper was only a front, and that Spielberg was the real director of Poltergeist. These rumors were not helped by MGM and Spielberg's responses to them. This is the way Spielberg described it. Tobe isn't a take charge sort of guy. If a question was asked and an answer wasn't immediately forthcoming, I'd jump in and say what we could do. Tobe would nod agreement, and that became the process of collaboration. The Directors Guild were understandably not happy, and an investigation was soon launched. The production was in the end fined $15,000 for making Spielberg's name bigger in marketing materials than Hooper's, but things quieted down some when Steven Spielberg and company released a statement in The Hollywood Reporter clarifying that Hooper was the real director of Poltergeist. Later on, some cast and crew claimed Spielberg did direct scenes, while others adamantly countered that Hooper directed the entire production. Then publicist later turned director Mick Garris visited the set several times. He falls into the Hooper camp. And I can see why. There's a heightened sense of hysteria in the performances, which is far more Hooper style than Spielberg's.
You only move the headstones! Fly! Fly!
Let me go! Let me go!
But on the other hand, the film does focus on themes common to Spielberg's cinema, and it does admittedly have the Spielberg touch, which of course a film co-written and produced by him would. To give the Poltergeist controversy some context, let me tell you a story that I once heard told by someone who worked on The Goonies. Spielberg produced and also came up with a story for that film, and when he was on set, he kept coming up with enthusiastic suggestions like a giddy schoolboy at play, much to director Richard Donner's frustrations. Some of the crew didn't like having their director undermined, even if it was unintentional, so they came up with a solution. They told Steven Spielberg that they were behind schedule and asked him to help them out by directing additional second unit material. Spielberg eagerly agreed, excited to help and to get things done right. The problem was solved, and all parties were happy. This might just be a story, perhaps one that's unfair to Steven Spielberg. It might just be gossip. But the picture this story draws seems to fit with the behind-the-scenes stories from Poltergeist, which was made only a couple of years prior. I think it's a shame that Poltergeist's directorial authorship is called into question. To me, it reads like a Tobe Hooper film that mimics the Spielberg style, but it's still a Hooper film. I'm going to trust Mick Garris on this. Tobe Hooper directed Poltergeist, and he deserves credit for how damn good the film is. We already know that Steven Spielberg is a genius, so he doesn't need another feather in his cap, particularly one that wasn't his to begin with. In addition to his film output, Tobe Hooper also delivered several episodes of television throughout his long career. Most memorable, perhaps, was the 1979 miniseries Salem's Lot, taken from the Stephen King novel. Salem's Lot adopted cultural touchstones from Nosferatu, but it also left a mark of its own. Its atmosphere and tone, scary yet mildly kitschy, influenced later works such as the iconic The Lost Boys. Also, its success launched the tradition of adopting Stephen King's novels into television miniseries, including a few works from Mick Garris. Later cinematic output from Tobe Hooper varied. with mostly uncelebrated low-budget films and some forays into TV, including a couple of episodes of Masters of Horror, which was developed and produced by, again, Mick Garris. Also, Hooper directed the first episode of the Steven Spielberg-produced miniseries Taken. Apparently, there were no hard feelings between the two men. Tobe Hooper passed away in 2017. In the obituaries and articles that followed, the accounting of his cinematic output focused mostly on the well-known classics Texas Chainsaw and Poltergeist. The rest of his works were seldom mentioned in media eulogies, but I think his full output as a director demonstrated why he was so important. His strange point of view in horror cinema unlocked new avenues of artistry, so clearly on display in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but also in other works as well. While his later films may not have altered horror history forever, they certainly are notable, and really, how many times does one single filmmaker need to change film history? Tobe Hooper did it once, and that is more than most. My name is Wolfcraft. This is History of Horror. If you liked the episode, I'd sure appreciate it if you liked, shared, and subscribed. Also, if you want to check out some of my other works, I'm an author. My science fiction novel God of Desolation is currently available on Amazon, and my upcoming urban fantasy mystery novel Richly Drawn will be available at inkshares.com in late 2021. Thanks aplenty.